Okay, so we were just talking about some of the various acts getting passed early on, which become kind of the tinderbox that sparks or ignites the American Revolution. So let's kind of keep pushing forward with those. And just to remind you about the stamp tax, how that caused so much uproar, being used to be affixed to basically a lot of documents, legal documents, papers, playing cards, anything like that, and then the no taxation without representation comes around. So just to reiterate that. And basically to voice their opinion against this, they formed the Stamp Act Congress. It's largely ignored, but it is a step towards that unity and showing protest. Eventually in 1766, though, the Stamp Act is repealed, but they do pass the Declaratory Act, which basically shows that they do have the power to bind the colonies and that they will treat the colonies just like any other British subject so that they can enforce things. And then here you can see some kind of examples of kind of the images here. We've got the affixed stamp tax that we see, obviously kind of symbolizing death and so forth. And then again, we have the repeal of the stamp tax, and you can kind of see the various things going on in here. And it's mourning, it's like a funeral, and it has various dates. And you can kind of see that kind of at this point in the transition from the individuals showing displeasure and then eventually having to repeal the Stamp Act because of so much hatred that's growing in the colonies. It's really not worth the British government to try and enforce it. And as I also mentioned before, the next series of taxes is going to be known as the Townshend tax, which pretty much put taxes on lead, paint, tea, paper, things like that. And it's all going to be repealed minus the tea tax. That's going to stay enacted. They're going to have a quartering act being reissued. And then we eventually see, because of so much presence of British troops in here and smuggling going on, an event happens known as the Boston Massacre. And you've got a video to watch that on John Adams just to kind of see that as innocent or are they guilty, were they defending themselves, all that kind of stuff. And then here we have two different depictions. One on the left is by Paul Revere. That would be a great example of propaganda. You see the colonists there on the left as they are basically seen as being unarmed and being attacked, while the one on the right looks as if mainly the people that are involved here, the British soldiers, look a little bit more as they're defending themselves from the American colonists as they attack with clubs and various other items at that point. But as you can tell, though, two different versions here and two different views of it, one being propaganda probably with the Boston Massacre by Paul Revere on the left, and others perhaps an English version on the right. Okay, one thing that the colonies are going to do really well is try and get the word out. So they created what are these known as these committees of correspondence. They spread propaganda and kept a lot of the mentality and the ideas flowing at this point. It's a network of letter writers, oftentimes in coastal areas where they have printing presses. One of the leaders of this movement is going to be Samuel Adams. It becomes kind of a forerunner or a stepping stone towards the Continental Congress, basically to try to keep the revolution spirit rolling at this point and keeping people informed of what's going on in each major port city or area of the colonies. Okay, so as we kind of move along in 1773, you've got the British East India Company. They're basically running bankrupt. And one way to try and get rid of some of this tea is to try and pour it onto America, because they're basically going to show up with a monopoly on this tea tax and try and sell it to us at a cheaper rate. And we kind of catch on to it. So on December 16th, 1773, a bunch of whites led by people like Samuel Adams and some of the members of the Sons of Liberty boarded English ships and opened up several 342 chests of tea and dumped them into the harbor there, and it's going to be known as the Boston Tea Party. These events will happen sporadically elsewhere. In Annapolis, it's a little bit more violent. They actually burned the ships to the ground. Some people supported it. Other people thought that, taxation is something that will happen, and that America was just being way defiant at this point and deserved punishment. And here is a relatively good representation of what apparently happened at this event. And you can see the colonists here dressed up as Native Americans in their attire as they dumped it into there. And you have over here, if you pan over here, some colonists dressed and watching them, kind of cheering them on as the events unfolded. So as a response to that, the British Parliament passes what some people call the Repressive Acts, other people call them Coercive Acts, but the colonists will call them the Intolerable Acts. This is going to be happening in 1774, and it's set up basically as a multi-part series of legislation there. What they're going to do is they're going to close down the port of Boston until they can pay for all the tea that was lost there. And if you know anything about Boston, they are a harbor town, and if they close down their port, it closes down their livelihood. And all their town hall meetings are going to be closed down pretty much without approval. The charter is going to be revoked. There as well, anybody who is being tried for any crimes at this point that is a British official usually is going to be transported to England, where they argue that they would have a, quote, fair trial, unquote. And then they're also going to start issuing a new quartering act to basically uphold this. And then lastly, after this, they passed the Quebec Act, which is really going to be adding insult to injury, where they basically extended the province of Quebec into the Ohio River Valley, where the Americans fought for the French and Indian War. So now they've given back to the enemy, previous enemy, lands that they had lost in the French and Indian War, and it also extended religious toleration to these Catholic French people, and these strongly Protestant people were very angry about that and infuriated them at this point. I mean, as you can tell there, the port's going to be closed to pay for the destroyed tea. Governors convened meetings, and British officials accused of crimes without standing trial in Britain would stand trial in Britain rather than Massachusetts. The new Quartering Act, basically, they can be housed in various buildings as well as homes. So now citizens are supposed to house and feed these troops as they're stationed, and they're already unwanted in this region. And here you can see the Quebec Act. As you can tell, the previous line that was kind of drawn would have cut them off severely here, but now it's basically extending the area of Quebec into the southern parts, and now they're basically neighboring with some of their former enemies and extending right. So you've got this Ohio River Valley area right here, and they're kind of extending into that area, which means that they're kind of encroaching on previously lost lands. Okay, by this point, people are starting to recognize that it's a time to start uniting, at least for some sort of cause. So they form what is known as the First Continental Congress. They meet in Philadelphia in early September, late October in 1774, basically to discuss and list their grievances. They're not a lawmaking body at this point, but they do come up with a list of grievances. They publish these. They're not pushing for independence, but for the most part, Parliament's going to ignore their advice here and their grievances. All the colonies go except for Georgia, and then they come up with their Declaration of Rights. They said that they'd meet again. By that point, though, in April of 1775, we're going to have the shot heard around the world, where in an effort to seize supplies and capture Samuel Adams and John Hancock, the British are going to have an encounter outside of Boston, nearby Lexington and Concord, and as a result of that, the war's basically starting with those first shots there. Minutemen, after having 8 of their own killed at Lexington, fought back at Concord, pushing back the Redcoats, shooting them from behind, basically using Indian warfare, guerrilla warfare. So it looks as if the war is actually ignited at this point, although we haven't formally declared our independence at this point. And so you can see here, perhaps the ideas being conveyed, as you can see within this picture here, the English, as they're more lined up in perfect lines, and then rather here, the Americans are a little bit less drilled and skilled at this point to fight this warfare that we see that's being fought by the others. On the other hand, we have kind of, you can see here where the actual battles of Lexington and Concord are happening. If you know anything, that is Boston right here. So as a detachment escapes, or rather goes to get supplies, they're going to be ambushed later on, and this kind of ignites the first shots for the war, the shot heard around the world. Okay, so going into this thing, the British government has a lot of strengths and weaknesses going against them. So they have some advantages, being that they have a lot of people. In comparison, they have a strong navy, probably the best in the world at this point, and a lot of money, and that helps them fight wars. But they're fighting a very unpopular war. You got to think that the British are actually fighting the British, so it's pretty much a civil war. So in order to help kind of boost troop numbers, they will hire a bunch of Hessians or German mercenaries. So George III does that to help supply them. They've got some loyalists, but you got to understand that mercenaries are usually only loyal to their paycheck. So as this kind of ignites, some of them will basically desert the military and oftentimes not be such great fighters that they thought they were going to be because they're only loyal to their check. You're also going to have some incidents here that I mentioned before. People don't really have a desire to kill other Americans, as we will see. There's going to be support by some British people actually for the American efforts. And at this point, the generals are apparently second-rate. Provisions are going to be scarce because they're fighting 3,000 miles away, so communication lines and information resources is going to be very difficult to keep them up to pace. And then lastly, we really don't have a single capital at this point to capture. So America could fight a defensive war and actually win this. We just got to outlast our enemy, which is the British. Okay, so now I'm going to outline a few of the pluses and minuses, mainly the advantages here. We got good leaders. We've got Benjamin Franklin as a great diplomat. I like how it writes it as a smooth diplomat. Makes me think of Michael Jackson's Smooth Criminal. But we've also got George Washington, who's got a little bit of experience in war. Not a great general within strategy, but a good leader. We'll also have the French aid eventually, first indirectly and secretly, and then eventually they will actually physically get involved. We've got some great leaders and people who believe strongly in our cause, like Marquis de Lafayette, who joins the ranks. They're also fighting defensive men, as I mentioned earlier, and self-sustaining. We're very good marksmen. Most of the people on the frontier knew how to hunt. That's one thing going for us. And we also have a moral advantage, and we're fighting for a cause we believed in very strongly, and we're also protecting our homes, which is one way to rally people other than like those mercenaries who are only fighting for a paycheck. Okay, when it comes to disadvantages, there's still several of those. We're not really united. There's a lot of people who aren't sure about this. About a third of the colonists are for the war, a third are against it as loyalists, and then there's a third who's not really too sure about it. At this point, there's a lot of sectionalism. The country's kind of divided on this. We have very little money, and it's very difficult to raise it. A lot of times soldiers had to bring their own weapons and provide their own resources, and we really don't even have a navy, so we've got a lot of disadvantages against us. But we are fighting on home turf, and we do have something we're fighting for, maybe a moral cause or whatever it seems to be at this point. Luckily, as this slide will point out, that we do get some help and we do get some support later on. We need the clothing, wagons, foods, other supplies, and at that point we're pretty well, we're not very trained. We're not a very effective military at this point when the war starts. So we do get some people like the German Baron von Steuben, who spoke no English apparently and whipped the soldiers into shape. So I guess he just screamed at them in German, which will make anybody jump and do anything that they're told to do. Some African Americans will actually fight in this war and die in hopes of actually achieving some freedom afterwards. Some of them will serve on the American side. Some will actually serve on the British side. So by the war's end, it says at least 1,400 blacks were evacuated in Nova Scotia and Jamaica and England. Many people also sold items to the British because the British actually had currency that worked, like gold. We overinflated our currency, as we'll see, by printing it, much like some people do during times of war. And there's people who didn't really care about it. So there's traitors, there's people who are reluctant to joining, and all these kinds of things. But luckily, over time, we do outlast them, and we do get the aid of the French after the Battle of Saratoga, which is very important because that brings us a navy, supplies, and extra forces to help fight this war. It's not because the French loved American ideals of the Declaration of Independence. It's because they hated the British and wanted to get back at them from the French and Indian War. Okay, that's going to sum everything up, and then we'll move on to the next topic in the next video. Good luck.